Imagine standing at the summit of a once unstoppable empire. The wind whispers through marble pillars, statues of emperors gaze down as though still commanding legions, and the ghosts of millions who served, labored, and died beneath its banner drift like shadows across great plazas. That empire, now crumbling in memory, once stretched from sea to sea, its power so immense that the world trembled at its feet. But what if I told you that the reasons for its collapse still echo in the fall of modern superpowers? Before we dive into the full story, subscribe and like Dark History Files. The story of why empires collapse is not just a chronicle of battles lost or rulers overthrown. It is a deeply human tale of ambition, decay, hubris, and the unpredictable currents of history. From the Roman legions to the Soviet tanks, from the mighty Ottoman cannon to the global reach of the British Empire, these great powers rose on pillars of strength, innovation, ideology, and unity. But in each case, those same pillars concealed fatal fractures. Their collapse was not inevitable. Indeed, many of the greatest empires might have persevered longer, but they were undone by a surprising mix of internal rot and external strain, by economic exhaustion and ideological crisis, by demographic change and logistical overextension. In this cinematic journey, we will explore the hidden forces behind the fall of empires, the corruption seeping through the Senate in Rome, the religious and ethnic fault lines tearing apart the Ottoman fabric, the poisonous complacency in the British political class, and the ideological paralysis within the Soviet communist system. As we trace their decline, you'll come to understand that collapse is not a sudden thunderclap, but a slow earthquake, shifting beneath the surface until the ground splits. We begin in the heart of the Roman Republic, a formidable entity that conquered the Mediterranean world, built roads spanning continents, and erected a system of law that would survive millennia. But as Rome expanded, its institutions buckled. Senators grew rich on plunder, provinces were mismanaged, armies drifted in loyalty from Rome to ambitious generals. Civil wars ripped the Republic apart. The very discipline that made Rome so powerful became the weapon of its own destruction. Corruption was rife, inequality rampant, and the loyalty of the provinces was purchased rather than earned. The Republic's collapse into an empire under Augustus was not a salvation. It marked the beginning of a new, more concentrated power, but one extremely vulnerable to the whims of its rulers. Emperors came and went, assassinated, deposed, sometimes dying of natural causes, sometimes at the hands of the Praetorian Guard. Each transfer of power invited violence, undermined stability, and weakened the state from within. The fabled Pax Romana masked festering unrest. The border legions grew restless, resources were drained, and external pressures from barbarian tribes increased. Rome's economy, once fueled by conquests, slowly ran dry as expansion slowed. Its infrastructure began to deteriorate, its workforce declined, and its ambitions outran its means. In time, the empire was split in two, and the western half crumbled under the weight of barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and political fragmentation. Yet even as Rome fell, its lessons lived on. Now fast forward across centuries and continents to the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe that once ruled Southeast Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. The Ottomans, at their height, commanded enormous wealth, military innovation, and a diverse, multi-ethnic realm. But beneath the grand mosques and sprawling palaces lay fragility. The empire was built on a delicate balance of religious authority, military power, and administrative complexity. When central power weakened, regional governors, pashas, beylerbys grew more independent. Corruption and nepotism metastasized. The palace intrigues, the harem politics, the courtly factions undermined meritocracy. And while the world industrialized, the Ottoman state clung to old traditions. Its military lagged behind. Janissaries resisted reform. Modernization was resisted by conservative elites who feared losing privilege. Economic stagnation became endemic. The empire borrowed heavily from European powers, falling into a debt trap that sucked its sovereignty dry. Meanwhile, nationalist movements like the Greeks, Armenians, Serbs, and Arabs were awakening, demanding self-rule. The ideological glue that had once held different peoples under Ottoman rule cracked under the strain of nationalism. Reformers like Mahmud II and later, the Tanzimat tried to centralize and modernize, but their efforts were half-hearted and often undermined from within. The Ottoman collapse after World War I was dramatic and violent but not wholly inevitable. It was the result of decades of deferred reforms, internal decay, corruption, and a failure to adapt to a changing world. Now imagine the British Empire, the empire on which the sun never set, whose navy ruled the waves, whose factories fueled the Industrial Revolution, and whose merchants shaped global trade. In its heyday, Britain exported not just goods but ideas, governance systems, and a sense of mission about civilization and progress. But the empire was built on a fragile economic foundation: the extraction of wealth from colonies, cheap labor, and the exploitation of resources. The enormous costs of 2 world wars drained British coffers, and yet the political class remained confident in its supremacy. After WWII, the cost of maintaining colonies soared, colonial resistance intensified, and public opinion in Britain shifted. In the metropole, the working class demanded social reform, and the political elite found itself increasingly out of touch. Meanwhile, the ideology that sustained empire, racial superiority, civilizing mission, was increasingly questioned. Nationalist movements in India, Africa, and elsewhere grew stronger, more organized, and more determined. Leaders from Gandhi to Nkrumah articulated powerful visions of self-determination. Economic decline came sharply. Britain's post-war debt, the loss of markets, rising welfare costs, and the Keynesian transformation of the economy left the empire unsustainable. The Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed Britain's diminished global stature. Culturally and politically, Britain was no longer the unchallenged master of its empire. Its power had to be relinquished. And then there is the Soviet Union, a superpower born from the Bolshevik Revolution, built on ideology, industrial ambition, and a sense of mission to reshape the world. The USSR emerged as a military-industrial giant and ideological rival to the West, but its very foundations contained the seeds of its collapse. The communist ideology promised equality and proletarian solidarity, but in practice, the system was riddled with bureaucratic inefficiency, corruption, and a stifling centralization of power. Political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed, creating a brittle facade of unity, but underneath, national tensions simmered in the Baltic republics, the Caucasus, Ukraine, and Central Asia. The command economy, once hailed as the future, became inflexible. Planners misallocated resources, industries stagnated, and consumer needs languished. The arms race with the West drained resources, and efforts to reform, Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, came too late and destabilized more than they healed. As openness spread, people saw the rot. Shortages, hush money, communist rhetoric that had once inspired was now hollow. The collapse came swiftly, unexpectedly to many, but looking back, it was a long erosion of legitimacy, ideology, and economic viability. Across all these empires, a recurring pattern emerges. Power concentrated at the center, overextension across lands, inequality that divides, corruption that metastasizes, and an inability to adapt to changing political, ideological, and economic realities. But there's more. Demographic shifts, falling birth rates, aging populations strain the social contract. Environmental pressures, famine, drought, disease undermine stability, and technological change outpaces traditional institutions, leaving empires behind. Other empires too, Ming China, the Aztecs and Incas, Qing China, the Spanish Empire, shared similar fates, but for our story, the echoes of Rome, Ottoman, British, and Soviet are most resonant today, because modern states still face these fault lines. In our own time, globalization, technological disruption, ideological polarization, climate change, and demographic decline threaten to unravel the bonds that hold powerful nations together. What lessons do these fallen powers leave us? That might is not enough. that legitimacy must be earned, not assumed, that institutions must be resilient, not rigid, and that adaptation is the only way to survive in a rapidly changing world. As we conclude this journey through the rise and fall of empires, we realize that collapse is not just the consequence of military defeat. It is the result of a breakdown of trust, a betrayal of ideals, a failure to reform, and ultimately, a failure of vision. The story of these great powers is also our story. How we choose to govern, how we balance ambition and restraint, how we build institutions that can last centuries, and how we preserve the delicate balance of power and justice. Subscribe to Dark History Files for more stories.